Hi and good morning. Welcome to the webinar. We're just a little bit before the top of the hour, so we'll make a start in a couple of minutes' time. But thanks for those of you that have dialed in. I can see that there's still plenty of folk joining. So yeah, thanks for being here in plenty of time, and we'll start in the next minute or so. Thanks for waiting. Hello and a very warm welcome to this webinar hosted by Delta EE. Today we're going to be talking about electric vehicle or EV charging and presenting highlights from our very latest European EV owner survey. My name is John Murray and I'm very pleased to be joined by two of my colleagues in our EV team, William Vanderbilt and Cara Sloan. Good morning, guys.
Good morning, John. Good morning, everyone.
Morning, everyone.
And I can hear you loud and clear, so that's good news. And Boris Johnson's also on the way out, so let's get started. So let's just get on to the next slide. So some brief housekeeping before we get into the real content. So as always, with these webinars, we'll try and keep our talking to about 45 minutes. We'll have some time at the end for Q&A. During the course of the webinar, you can write down your questions. Hopefully there'll be a box on the right-hand side of your screen where you can submit questions. We may try and get to some of those throughout the webinar, but we'll certainly make sure there's time at the end to answer those questions. The webinar should be recording if I press the right button, and we'll be pleased to send out the slides to you afterwards as well. So the agenda for the session today, I'll give a brief introduction to us, the company, and also the EV charging service, provide an overview of the EV owner surveys that we've conducted over the last years, and then we'll get into the content, two sections, one around how electric vehicle drivers are charging, and then secondly, how electric vehicle drivers are engaging with energy within the home. We will do a poll question, and then there's that time at the end for questions and answers. So Delta EE, who are we? I think most of you on the call will be familiar with us already, but essentially we are a research and consulting company that is focused entirely on the energy transition. We provide bespoke consultancy and also ongoing in-depth research services across a number of different topics within new energy. On your slide, you can see the different clusters that we have around different knowledge areas. But for Will, Cara, and myself, our focus is entirely on EV charging, and the main focus of our work is delivering our ongoing EV charging research service. And all of the content that we're going to be presenting during the course of this webinar is taken directly from this service. We've been doing this now for over 4 years and providing insights, data, forecast, opinion on what's going on across the European market for EV charging. We talk about the 4 pillars: home, public, fleets, and smart charging. We cover all of those within the service, and we're providing really in-depth, granular, bottom-up quant data, qualitative insights, which is essentially the story behind the numbers, if you like, and customer research is a really important part of what we do, and that's what we're going to be presenting on during this webinar. So this is the service. And if anyone's got if you'd like more information about what the service is and how it can support you, then of course, please feel free to get in touch with us at any time. So into the content, and specifically the surveys. So earlier this year, around April time, we received the results back from our 4th annual EV owner survey. We've been doing these for 4 years now. And over that time, we've surveyed over 3,300 electric vehicle drivers, and this is both fully electric, BEVs, and also plug-in hybrids. We've covered now 8 markets in Europe, so we've been surveying EV owners within 8 different countries. You can see there on the map the markets that we've covered, but the UK, France, Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, Spain, Norway, and for the first time this year, we've also surveyed EV drivers within Poland. BEV drivers, fully electric drivers, account for 62% of those respondents, and 38% of those drivers are plug-in hybrid owners. And those 8 countries represent 78%, so well over 3/4 of all EVs on the road in Europe today. So a really representative sample of what's going on, not just in those 8 countries, but actually across all of Europe. So really pleased to have the opportunity to present some of the results from these surveys during the course of this webinar. And one of the really key things that the survey allows us to do is understand the products and services that electric vehicle drivers are using to charge at home. And this is one of the questions that we ask, which helps us to derive some conclusions. And we ask where existing EV drivers are parking their vehicles. And today, nearly 8 out of 10, so 80% of electric vehicle drivers have access to off-street car parking, either in a private garage, a driveway, or a carport. You can see the bar chart on the right-hand side shows the variations from country to country, but essentially that orange bar is showing you those drivers that have got access to off-street car parking. Certainly, our survey indicates that Italy and Norway, all existing EV drivers, have got the highest share of off-street car parking. Italy's an interesting one because the overall building stock in Italy suggests that there's a lower share of off-street car parking in terms of the building stock, but of those very early adopter EV drivers, a relatively high percentage, 83% of those have got off-street car parking. At the other end of the spectrum, Spain, only 61% of Spanish EV drivers have got access to off-street car parking. So you can see the variations from market to market. The other key thing to point out on that chart on the right-hand side is those horizontal grey bars, and that's essentially representing the overall households, not just EV drivers, but the overall housing stock in terms of those with access to off-street car parking. So one of the conclusions that we can draw from this is that the share of off-street car parking of EV drivers is likely to reduce quite significantly over time as the EV market matures. But certainly those early adopters of EV drivers are much more likely to have off-street car parking. So that's just sort of setting a bit of the scene for the survey and the types of questions that we are answering within the survey. For our EVCS subscribers, we've already published or updated our database, which has the results from all 4 years of the survey. And we're in the process of publishing a series of reports, which is getting under the skin of what's going on within those surveys and providing some insights on what those surveys are telling us. So those are all deliverables that are available for our subscribers. So now we're going to get into a bit more about how EV drivers are charging, and very pleased to introduce Cara to lead on this section.
Great, thanks, John. Yeah, so just starting with how EV drivers are charging in the home, we saw ChargePoint ownership growing to 58% this year, which was up from 50% in 2021. And as you can see in the graph, there are a couple of markets where this increase was most notable. So the percentage of French EV drivers using a dedicated charge point has increased from 37% in 2021 to 51% in 2022. And although it is still one of the lowest of all the markets, it is quite interesting because previously we've seen French EV drivers using a socket to charge, but yeah, this is no longer the dominant option there. Also quite notable is Spain. So the percentage of EV drivers using a dedicated charge point in Spain has increased from 44% in 2021 to 64% in 2022. And yeah, you can see the total figure there, the increase too. So I guess there's then kind of a question around why charge point ownership figures are still growing at quite a steady rate in all markets surveyed. Yeah, I think in the medium term, we somewhat expected that the ratio would fall, and those without off-street parking, as they transition to EVs, yeah, we would see that fall. But even more mature markets like Norway are still trending upwards. So something that to consider would maybe be the effect of COVID, as is also the case with things like smart meters. Installations of charge points couldn't go ahead for quite a long time, resulting in quite a big backlog of jobs. And with people working from home more, there's definitely increased demand. So once these installations in the home were possible, can see the increase, and it might just take a while for this to kind of balance out. But yeah, I don't know if John or Will, you have other thoughts or maybe explanations on why we're still seeing this upward trend.
Yeah, thanks, Cara. I mean, it was really interesting to get this result back from the survey earlier this year, because like you mentioned, Cara, I mean, our assumption and expectation is that in the sort of medium to long term, that the share of EV drivers with dedicated home charge point will decrease, because there's going to be fewer drivers with access to off-street car parking, and they'll have to rely more on public infrastructure and workplace charging and things like that. So when we initially saw this result, we were kind of scratching our heads a little bit to understand kind of what could be the thing that's driving this share point, this share of charge point ownership going up. This is from the survey that we conducted in early 2021 last year, and then earlier this year. And yeah, you're right. I mean, it could be a COVID-related thing, and people couldn't have installed charge points in 2020 because of COVID. They could get a car, but they couldn't get somebody out to their home to install a charge point. And one of the other opinions is around the auto OEMs, who are now increasingly bundling or offering a charging solution together with the vehicle, something which is maybe not quite so present back in 2019, 2020. So that might have just increased the share of EV drivers that are getting a home charge point.
I think it's interesting that even a country like Norway, or a market like Norway, which is the most advanced EV market in Europe, and you would assume there that EVs are starting to reach mass market. Even there, the percentage of EV drivers which are installing a home wall box is increased from 2021 to 2022, and it could be for all the reasons as John and Cara have said. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see over the next couple of years exactly how that percentage trends, whether it keeps going upwards or whether it drops over the medium to long term, as we anticipate in our forecasts.
Yeah. And given it's something that we didn't quite expect, and we're developing hypotheses about this, we thought this would be a great time to actually get the opinions from the audience as well. So this is where we're going to introduce our poll question. So the question is, why might the share of home charge point ownership have increased in the last 12 months? And there are 5 options that we're going to put forward. So it's the car manufacturers increasingly offering wall box alongside the vehicle. More wall box products on offer at affordable prices. So maybe just it's a sign that the market is maturing and there's more options for drivers to choose from, and prices may be coming down for certain products. Could be related to the introduction of more smart or time of use or EV tariffs, which can really best be captured if you've got a connected wall box. It could be the point that Cara made around COVID just preventing the installation of wall boxes during 2020. And then there's another point as well around incentives being introduced which can increase the attractiveness of a home wall box, or indeed being withdrawn, which can often lead to a rush in wall boxes being installed before that funding has run out or the incentive ends. And we've certainly seen some of that in Germany over the last year or so. Or indeed there might be another response, so please feel free to put those into the question box if you've got another opinion. So this is the poll question. Let us just see if we can launch this and get the opinions from everyone that's dialed in. So hopefully you can see that on your screen. And this is not just to select one option. You can select, I think you can select, or hopefully you can select as many or as few options as you wish. I can see that people are starting to submit their answers. So thank you very much for those. I can see that about a third of you so far, well now almost a half, have answered, so thank you very much for that. I can see the answers coming in. We'll give it another 10 or 15 seconds, then we'll close the poll and present the results. I can see that 3/4 of folk have submitted their answers. I'll give you another 5 seconds. All right, thank you very much for those that have voted. I think most of you have, so let's close the poll now. And I think I can share the results there. Right, can we see the results on the screen? Yeah, okay. It's very small for me, but hopefully it's good for you, for everyone else. So what are the results saying? Car ownership, so auto OEMs increasingly offering wall box, 52%, 54% more wall boxes at affordable prices, about a quarter of you thinking more smart EV tariffs, COVID about 20% I think, and then incentives being withdrawn about 40%. So quite a spread. What's our reaction, Will, Karen? What do we think?
I think, yeah, interesting that there's a spread and kind of mimics our discussion that we had about this yesterday, where it's a surprising result in the number of potential options. But I'm quite happy to see that my suggestion around the auto OEMs offering wall boxes alongside the vehicle, we actually capturing that customer at the point of vehicle sale, that came out quite strongly.
Yeah, also interesting to see that the auto OEM route, and yeah, we'll kind of come on to that a bit later in the presentation too. Yeah,
and there's a couple of questions or people putting forward their opinion in the question box. Certainly a couple of folk mentioning that, yeah, it's a reflection of the fact that a very high share of existing drivers today are the early adopters that have off-street car parking, which is absolutely the case. So it very much is the case that most EV drivers today have got off-street car parking. I guess the surprise for us was just to see the increase from year to year, from one year to the next, in terms of why that share has increased. But I think the responses to the poll is suggesting that it's maybe not a clear-cut one thing. It may be a multitude of different factors which are lending themselves towards this trend that we have seen in our survey. Okay, thanks very much for that. That's really great to get that feedback and that insight. Hopefully that's interesting for you, the listeners as well. But let's carry on with the presentation and back to you, Cara.
Thanks. So yeah, I think to understand that upward trend, it's also quite helpful to look at what's motivating EV drivers to buy a home charge point. So we've got here the top 3 factors over the 4 years of the survey. So the first factor at 23% was faster charging speeds, and this was an important factor for all markets. Second to that was convenience. So 22% of respondents said their motivation for installing a home charge point was for improved convenience of charging. And the market where this was most dominant was France, where it included 31% of home charge point owners. And yeah, I guess in terms of what improved convenience means, I suppose it points towards maybe having an app to control charging or to see energy spending. And it might just also be having more of kind of a dedicated space for charging rather than having to pull a lead from a socket through your house and out to the car. And then the third most important motivation was improved safety. So notably, this accounted for 43% of responses in Norway, which was much higher than the other markets. And yeah, in Norway, the second most popular method of charging has generally always been a regular socket, second to the dedicated home charge point. So maybe safety is a consideration as people move away from that. And then just looking at the fourth motivation as well, which was to control charging, to charge at times when electricity is cheaper. I think based on the energy crisis over the last couple of years, I probably would have expected this to play more of a role, but there has been an increase from 14% in 2019 and 2020 to 16% in 2022. And in terms of the markets where this stood out, this was the top motivation in Spain.
I think linking this back to the poll question around why have we seen more EV drivers purchasing home wall boxes, and yeah, one of the options there was the emergence of smart tariffs, and this links to that. And I think, as you mentioned, Cara, the energy crisis and yeah, high energy prices will be really interesting to see in next year's survey what that percentage is. And my hypothesis would be that that this is going to increase throughout the decade.
And just to confirm, the results are presented there in that chart is sort of an aggregation over the 4 years that we've asked this question, Cara, right?
Yes, yeah, that's right.
And then you've got a bit of commentary there around sort of how the results have changed from year to year, and we can see it a little bit in terms of, you know, this is increasing in importance, being able to charge at times when it's cheaper. You know, 16% in 2022 versus 13% in previous years. So it is rising up the agenda, and like you say, Will, it may rise further as the energy crisis or price crisis hits and bites harder over the winter. Great.
Thanks. So yeah, quite interestingly, home charge point brand awareness is quite weak, with 51% stating that they don't know the manufacturer brand of their charge point. So this might be a bit of an indication that home charge points will become more commoditized and simply just be seen as another household white good like a fridge. And I think that this lack of awareness is likely to continue as EVs and charge points become more mass market, and you maybe move past those early adopters or like tech enthusiasts. 49% stated that they did know the manufacturer of their charge point, but I think it's worth noting there that some of those respondents, when they were asked the open question, weren't actually able to provide a brand name. So the reality of that might be that it's even less than the percentage shown. And in 2022, there were quite a large number of brands mentioned, so over 30, with Tesla appearing the most. But this might be a bit more reflective of a strong brand presence rather than the actual market share.
Yeah, I mean, we've asked this question in our survey for at least the last 3, if not 4 years, in terms of what brand of wall box folk are putting in. And it was really surprising in the first years when we did this that there was not such high awareness of the brand of wall box that is being used. So yeah, it's really interesting to see how that can, you know, might evolve even more as we get more to a mass market and folk that are even less engaged in terms of the types of products that are going into their home.
Thanks. Yeah, so then just briefly on to the charge point route to market. So it's quite clear from the graph that vehicle dealerships do play quite a key role, with 42% of respondents saying that their charge point came with the vehicle or they purchased it from their vehicle dealership. So a few market highlights from that was 60% of the respondents in France said that they acquired their home charge point this way. And yeah, I guess this maybe links to quite a strong presence of French auto OEMs. So, for example, Renault and Peugeot, and they have historically bundled the home charge point with the vehicle. It seems to have moved past this somewhat towards kind of more established partnerships between auto OEMs and charge point market leaders. I think it will be interesting in the future to see, with kind of the potential growth of the second-hand EV market, if this vehicle dealership channel might decrease as drivers acquire their cars through different routes. The second point on this graph is energy suppliers. So they're currently only capturing quite a small part, so 14% of the home charge point market. But we think that they're in quite a strong position to offer innovative home charging propositions, because they can bundle tariffs and charge points together, and even beyond that, other home energy products like solar PV. And another point that makes us feel that energy suppliers are in a strong position here is that 32% of EV drivers surveyed said that they have changed their electricity contract as a result of getting their EV, and a further 37% said that they would consider switching their contract. So there's a bit of potential there for movement, and obviously it's been slightly more difficult and restricted with the energy crisis, but we do think that there's an opportunity for energy suppliers to offer charge point bundles, and also for them to benefit from higher usage customers too. In terms of market, I think it's quite surprising that this route to market isn't quite so prominent in Germany, where it seems that consumers do kind of shop around for cheaper tariffs. So about 41% of German respondents said that they have switched their electricity contract as a result of getting their EV. So yeah, interesting that it wasn't higher there. But we do have a more in-depth report on residential EV tariffs, which was led by our new energy business models team. So we've got kind of more in depth on that.
Yeah, and I was going to make the point as well that this route to market sort of sales channel analysis of how customers are buying their wall boxes through different means, bundled with the vehicle or with their energy provider, or direct from the charge point manufacturer or through an installer. And this is something that we've been looking at in quite a lot of detail over the last year or two. And we published a report for our subscribers towards the end of last year that we're looking at this on a sort of country level. And there's lots of variation from market to market, like you've already highlighted, Cara, in terms of how these wall boxes are getting to the customer. And it's a really important thing to understand for any sort of manufacturers or retailers of wall boxes to really understand what those sales channels are, and also importantly how that's going to evolve in the future as auto OEMs develop new propositions, as energy suppliers develop new propositions that are perhaps bundling the wall box with other products or services. So thanks for that, Cara. And then I think this is your last slide in this section.
It is, yeah. So just a little bit on public charging. So this is just results from 2021. But yeah, in a lot of cases with public charging, you can't just kind of park up and charge, and many public charge points don't accept credit or debit cards. So we found that EV drivers have to manage multiple network-specific charging cards or apps and accounts, which doesn't really provide the most seamless user experience. So nearly 60% of EV drivers surveyed in 2021 carried more than one charging card, and 49% actively used these multiple charging cards. So that kind of points to saying that even if drivers own the cards, they don't even necessarily use them. But hopefully requiring more than one charging card is likely to diminish in the future as interoperability increases, plug and charge becomes more mainstream, and contactless payments become more common. And I guess ISO standards are helping that on its way. But yeah, I suppose there's also technological change in vehicles and charging hardware that needs to happen too.
Great, thanks, Cara. And already starting to be a little bit conscious of the time, we'll move straight into the next section around how electric vehicle drivers are engaging with their energy supply at home.
Thanks, John. And just a reminder to the audience that if you do have any questions, please feel free to type them into that questions box, and we'll answer them as we go along, and also answer a number at the end.
Good, make sure to pick out the difficult ones for you, Will, during your section.
Thank you. So moving on to the EV driver and how they engage with energy, and we're going to start off with EV drivers and switching tariff. And as you can see on the graph here, just over 2/3 of EV drivers have considered or have switched their electricity contract, and nearly 1/3 have actually switched their electricity contract. And a good reference point to determine if this is high or not is the national average switching rates, which are shown on the left hand side of the slide. And you can see there the average switching rate amongst the countries that we included in the survey is around 16%, where for EV drivers, over 2/3 have switched their electricity contract. So this is telling us two things. Firstly, that EV drivers are much more engaged with their energy usage than the average customer. And secondly, this is a really great opportunity for energy suppliers. So EV drivers who purchase their vehicle, it's a great opportunity for electricity suppliers to acquire new customers. And this is especially relevant considering that EV drivers are great customers. They're really high usage customers. So, and they have flexible loads. So it's a great opportunity for electricity suppliers to acquire new and good customers. On the next slide, we show that whilst EV drivers are more engaged with their energy usage than the average user, less than half of them are actually on a time of use tariff. And this prevents two things. Firstly, it prevents the EV driver from being able to optimize when they charge their EV. So for example, charging it overnight to get cheaper electricity rates. But it also prevents the EV driver from being incentivized to charge at times which are optimal for the energy system or the environment. Now, time of use tariffs might not actually be the best option for the EV driver because it looks at or takes into account the whole household's energy use. But and this has led to the development of what we call EV specific tariffs, such as type of use tariffs, which would only say provide a price for the EV charging, and the household will be on a different electricity price. But the next graph shows that even with EV specific tariffs, less than a quarter of EV drivers are on an EV specific tariff. So we have a situation here where firstly EV drivers are engaged customers and they're willing to switch their electricity contract, but the majority of EV drivers are not on a time of use tariff, or they're not on an EV specific tariff. And as the next slide shows, the majority of EV drivers have a smart meter installed. So they're actually able to benefit from these time of use tariffs or EV specific tariffs. So this tells me that there's a problem, but also an opportunity here. The problem is that we're not creating the right charging incentives for the EV driver that will benefit the EV driver, but also benefit the energy system. But there is an opportunity here for energy suppliers to acquire these highly valuable customers. And so on the next slide, we can dive a little bit deeper into this and actually look at the energy devices which are inside EV drivers' homes. And we're starting with the home charge point itself. And the key point here is that the proportion of home charge points installed, which are smart, is increasing from year to year. So you can see for EV drivers who purchased their vehicle in 2018, only around 50% of those home charge points which were installed were internet connected. Whereas compare that to EV drivers who purchased their EV in 2021 or later, 74% of those home charge points that were installed were internet connected. And we expect this trend to continue over time as the benefits from having a connected and controllable home charge point increase, but there's also policy that's incentivizing this. So for example, In the UK, there's smart charging regulations which came into force a week or so back, which mandates that all home charge points installed need to be connected and controllable. So we expect this trend to increase over the decade. And the second device that we look at is the penetration of solar PV within EV drivers. And as you can see in the graph below, over a third of EV drivers have solar PV installed. And German and Dutch EV drivers are outliers here. They've got a much higher percentage. So 45% of German EV drivers have solar PV installed, and around 60% of Dutch EV drivers have solar PV installed, which is a really high percentage. And our hypothesis here is that in the early days, solar PV owning customers were likely to be early adopters of EVs. So they were targeted as potential early adopters of EVs. But as EVs outpace, the growth of EV adoption outpaces the growth of solar adoption, our hypothesis is that this relationship is actually going to switch around, and EV customers are going to be the likely adopters of solar PV. And we've mentioned the energy crisis earlier in this webinar, but that's another incentive for households and especially EV drivers who are high energy usage customers to install solar PV. So on the next slide, we're going to try and pull all of these slides together and kind of discuss what this means. So there are four pieces to this puzzle. We've got EVs, which are high energy demand, but also a highly flexible load. We've got the fact that EV drivers are increasingly likely to have a smart charge point installed or a connected and controllable charge point. We also have the fact that EV drivers are very likely to have a smart meter, and a high percentage or a higher percentage than average of them have other household devices or energy devices in the house, like solar PV or electric heating. And we've also got the fact that EV drivers are a lot more engaged with their energy supply or energy usage and are open to switching electricity contracts. And on the next slide, we kind of bring in the so what of this. So for the first 2 points, the fact that EVs have high energy demand and a highly flexible load, and that they have a smart charge point, which means you can manage their charging. This is a really big opportunity to take advantage of this flexible load to help us decarbonize the energy system. And the fact that EV drivers are very likely to have a smart meter and a high percentage of them have other energy devices in the house, and the fact that they engage with the energy usage and are open to switching supply, this is a really big opportunity for the energy suppliers to create innovative tariff propositions for these EV drivers, which will result in higher customer acquisition. And the second opportunity, that the fact that EV drivers or for energy suppliers can create these innovative tariffs, such as time of use tariffs or EV specific tariffs, actually will help us take advantage of this flexible load of EVs to help decarbonize the energy system. And I think that is it from my side, John.
Cool, yeah, thanks, Will. I was just looking, there's one or two questions that came in that are specific to your slides, Will. There's one around, do the main energy suppliers all offer EV specific tariffs?
So the answer is no. Definitely a decent proportion of the big energy suppliers do offer EV tariffs and are increasingly offering EV tariffs. But what we have seen in the market is that it's actually the smaller, more innovative or agile energy suppliers which have been the first movers in offering EV tariffs. And they've been the ones that are almost pushing the market to have these innovative tariffs aimed at EV drivers. And I think whilst there is a high potential for EV drivers, we also need to realize that still really early days in this market, and EV drivers represent a really small proportion of the total addressable market for these energy suppliers. So that could be one of the reasons why the bigger players haven't yet all provided energy or EV specific tariffs, because the size of the prize today is still really small compared to say 2030, 2035 when the market matures.
Yeah. And I think probably one of the other limiting factors right now is just the situation we're in with rising energy prices and price caps in some markets, which is really preventing innovation actually in some cases, and being able to offer new products and services where actually, as you mentioned, Will, the EV drivers today represent a very small proportion of the customer base, and actually for energy retailers, they really need to focus on sort of the mass market and making sure that the propositions that they're offering are going to be suitable for the market conditions today and the context of very high energy prices. There's another question that's come in. Okay, well actually let's come back to the questions when we get to the Q&A bit shortly. But thank you for that, Will. Great insights. So just to say a little bit more about the service that we offer, so the EV charging service. I already mentioned that we're providing in-depth insights, data, forecasts, and opinion about what's happening across the European EV charging market. This slide here, I've just taken some screenshots from our subscriber portal. So you can see, hopefully you can see it's a bit small, but some of the deliverables that we have on the portal, a number of different databases, our forecasts for charge points and also for vehicles, the results from the customer research that we presented during this webinar, a database looking at who are some of the leading players offering propositions within EV charging. So that's CPOs, EMSPs, charge point manufacturers, and a whole range of other players. A database that's very relevant actually to the discussion we've just had, looking at the propositions that are being offered by energy retailers, offering potentially EV tariffs bundled with access to public charging or with a charge point, for example. And then a database that we published for the first time this year, looking at the incentives that are there both for electric vehicles and also the charge points. And then a whole range of different reports and viewpoints across different topics, whether that's home charging, fleet charging, public charging, and so on. So all of this content, 4 years worth of insights and deliverables, is available to to access immediately for our EV charging service subscribers. Okay, thanks very much for listening. We've got some time at the end for Q&A, so feel free to submit your questions, and we'll maybe take 5 to 10 minutes now before the end of the webinar to respond to some of the questions that have come in during the course of the webinar, and I can see there's some more coming in just now as well. There was one question that I saw a minute or two ago related to solar PV. So do you know the level of solar PV ownership within the EV base versus the non-EV owner base? Because we presented our view that around about a third of EV drivers have solar across Europe. I'm not sure offhand exactly how many non-EV drivers have got solar, but it's significantly lower than that. I'm not sure if it's somewhere in the region of 5 to 10%, but it's a much lower share. So I guess that tells us two things. One is that the early adopters of EVs are in that demographic, frankly, where they're more able to have a larger house and more able to afford solar PV. But also the case that maybe those early adopters of EVs are just more inclined to be investing in sort of renewable energy tech, like solar, like electric vehicles, and things like that. Right,
and I think that leads on to that one other question around, are EV drivers ready to pay more if it's green energy? And what we have found is we do ask in our survey what their main motivation is for purchasing an EV, and consistently the environmental concerns, or I bought it to be more environmentally friendly, has been in in the top 1 or 2 reasons for EV drivers purchasing an EV. So we do know that the environmental reason is a big driver, and you can almost, I guess, assume from there that they would be willing to pay extra for a green or renewable energy tariff.
Yeah, thanks, Will. And okay, so there's a question here around The potential for aggregators or retailers to sell the flexibility offered by EVs, I guess, to the market. So this is, I guess, a question around smart charging and the ability of EV drivers to help balance the grid at times of high demand, for example, or localized network issue constraints, which can perhaps be relieved by either turning down chargers or potentially even in the world of vehicle to grid and bidirectional chargers, and providing that energy back to the grid to support times of peak demand and things like that. So it is an integral part of what we look at within our service. It's one of our 4 columns, the smart charging. We've published various things looking at the potential for this. One example is a report, what was it called, Will, that we published towards the end of last year? Smart charging and go on.
Energy system services, smart charging
energy services. Yeah. I mean, I guess the upshot here is that there's a huge amount of potential, and smart charging is going to become increasingly important, especially in terms of these front of meter services or to provide grid services. And there are already some players that are developing propositions and have propositions in the market that are doing this. I think it's fair to say that it's fairly early days, and actually this will become a much bigger thing in the future as the number of EVs increases, as markets open up to allow these propositions to develop. But Will, you're our smart charging expert. What else do you want to add to that question?
So firstly, yes, it is something we looked at, and it is something that's happening in the market where you've got smart charging service providers or energy retailers looking at utilizing that flexibility from EVs to either provide energy system services like ancillary services, but also for energy suppliers, importantly, to optimize their position on the wholesale energy market. There's a big opportunity there. But as John said, and as Joseph's actually mentioned, it's really early days, and whilst there are propositions on the market today where an EV driver can offer their EV or their load to be optimized, it's still very early days, and I think we need a higher penetration of EVs to actually make these services to make these services viable. It's just too early for aggregators to really get a big enough load from EVs today. So it is something that players are looking at, and I think the size of the prize is high, but it's still very early days for that. And what's a lot more common today is to utilize that smart charging or managed charging to optimize what we call behind the meter revenue stream. So that's making sure that you're charging at the cheapest time of day if you're on a time of use tariff, or if you've got solar PV, making sure that you're using all of that solar PV when you can to charge their vehicle. That's almost the first step, and then the second step is providing this demand side response, which we're still in the process of getting there.
Yeah. Thanks, Will. Just looking at some of the other questions that have come in. One quick question, are you going to release the slides afterwards? The short answer is yes, and if anyone would like a copy of the slides, then please feel free to email Will, Cara, or myself afterwards, and we will be very happy to send you the slides. Yeah, there's a question around, have we discussed this already? The extent to which EV drivers are willing to pay more for green energy?
Yeah, we touched on that briefly, saying, yeah, they are generally environmentally motivated EV drivers. One of the reasons why they purchase the EV is environmental. And I wonder if, that results in them being able or being willing to pay extra for a green energy supply.
Yeah. And then let's do one more question. So it's around the perception of EV drivers when it comes to a home charge point versus on-road charging in terms of recurring costs. So I'm not sure if this question is related to the cost of charging at home versus the cost of public charging, or actually whether it's around actually the payoff between investing in a home charge point to be able to benefit from lower home tariff costs versus not buying a home charge point and just relying on public charging infrastructure. But either way, I think our assumption is, and what we're seeing in the market is that if you've got the ability to install a home wall box and you've got off-street car parking, then the majority of drivers are doing that if they've got the ability to, just because of the convenience factor, some of the factors you mentioned before, Cara, and the ability to be able to access cheaper prices, particularly off-peak prices, overnight charging, that sort of thing. It just makes so much more sense if you've got off-street car parking to charge at home where possible. Now, of course, the cost of charging in public is typically significantly higher actually than the prices for home charging. So there's definitely a kind of an issue there, which I think is going to rise up the agenda of the disparity in pricing for charging vehicles for those that don't have access to off-street car parking. So potentially being more penalised by not taking advantage of, being able to take advantage of off-peak home charging rates. The particular issue in the UK with the VAT rates, which are different. Higher for public charging versus the residential home tariffs, which are lower. So I don't know if that answers the question, but yeah, there's definitely different motivations and elements at play when it comes to charging at home versus in public, and certainly if you're not able to charge at home, then the price you'll pay for energy to charge the vehicle will always be a lot higher. Right, I think we've covered most of the questions. I think if we haven't come to your question, then apologies for that, and we may pick it up offline. Thanks for listening. I hope it's been interesting and valuable for you. Do feel free to get in touch afterwards if you'd like to talk about any of the things that we presented, or if you'd like to learn more about the service, and if you have and anything you want to speak to us about, we're always open to having a discussion offline. So thanks very much for your time, and hopefully see you at some point soon.
Thank you all.
Thanks all. Bye.
Thanks, guys.